If you live in the United States and you currently own a home or you're looking to buy a home in the future, then this video is for you. The real estate industry is going through some changes, and I want to walk you through the main changes that you may need to know as you go through the process of selling your home or buying a new home in the coming years. And I want to give you the story so far. So in the recent years, there have been several lawsuits against the NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors, the trade body that supports the real estate community and several real estate brokerages. As of August 2024, several of these parties have entered into a settlement agreement, and this has resulted in a bundle of practice changes, fundamentally changing the way real estate transactions are actually happening in the United States going forward. So there's three big changes coming to the real estate business in 2024. The first one is a representation approach. This means that based on our licensed agents helping us, there's going to be representation involved in every part of the transaction. The second one is a little bit more technical. We call this decoupling of compensation. And I will actually break this down and how this works for you overall with a couple of scenarios. And the third, there are some processes and practice upgrades to allow you to understand how the process works and how your agent is going to deal with all of this. So let's get into the first part of this, which is understanding the representation part. So on the left-hand side of the page is going to be what has happened in the past, and on the right-hand side of the page is going to be what happens in the future. So let's say you're a homeowner who's looking to sell your home. So what you would do in the old world is you would enter into what we call a listing agreement. And you would enter into this listing agreement with an agent, and this agent would then have the responsibility to represent you as the seller, to bring your home to market and do everything that needs to be done to get it sold. This is the traditional way it's been done, and the best part going forward is this process will be the same. There may be some small changes in the implementation of the forms and the contracts, but in the philosophical way, the listing side is going to stay the same. So let's talk about the buyer side of the situation. So let's say we have three potential buyers. There's generally been an informal relationship between the buyers and their agents. So each buyer would say, help me tour properties, teach me about contingencies and offer strategies, and help me get into the home that I want. So with these three buyers, there was an informal representation overall. Now going forward, the rule set calls for a formalization of representation, which means each of these agents and these buyers need to enter into what we call a buyer representation agreement. So there's going to be a buyer representation agreement on the front end of the relationship that then allows each of the agents to help their clients, which starts with the first home that they tour. So the main distinction right now that you should note is that before touring homes, before being actively engaged in working with a real estate agent, we need to engage into a buyer representation agreement, very similar to how we engage into a listing agreement to sell the house. So when you contact your agent about this, you will be requested to go through this process, and they will explain the agreement and tell you all about the terms associated with it. Now, one question that I get asked often is, hey Matt, if there's an open house down the street and I want to go check it out, would I need a buyer representation agreement in place before I go see this open house? No. The open house is a public event that's being done on behalf of the seller with representation of the seller by the listing agent. So you as a buyer or a previewer of the property would not need a buyer representation agreement. But most importantly, before you buy the home, you will need to have a buyer representation agreement in place. So now that you know there is another agreement involved in the home buying process, you may be thinking, well, what are all the agreements? So there's three agreements that govern a real estate transaction. There's a listing agreement, a buyer agreement, and there is a purchase agreement. And I'll tell you which parties are involved in all of these. The listing agreement is between the seller of the house or the homeowner with the listing agent. The buyer agreement is between the home buyer and the buyer agent. And the third is the purchase agreement, which is between the seller of the home and the buyer of the home. So the first two agreements actually talk about representation, listing agreement and buyer agreement. And then the purchase agreement is the offer. And an offer is just the terms of exchange. So this agreement is the terms of exchange. And the other two agreements, again, are representation. Overall, these three agreements broadly govern a real estate transaction in total. So based on your situation, you will have two of these agreements, either a buyer agreement and a purchase agreement, or a listing agreement and a purchase agreement. So again, the first big point was representation. The second is decoupling of compensation. So first I want to explain how it worked in the past and then how it works now and going forward. So in the past, let's say a seller put their home on the market for $100,000, and let's say they agreed to pay a total commission of $10,000. And the listing agent agrees to $6,000, which means there's $4,000 available to the buyer agent. So the seller in this case would pay $10,000 to the listing agent. And what the listing agent would do at closing of the transaction is they would keep $6,000 out of the $10,000, and then they would share the extra $4,000 with the buyer agent. And this way the buyer does not come out of pocket for the $4,000 themselves. And this process of sharing commissions is called cooperation compensation. This has been a fundamental thing that has been in place until now. So let me tell you about what's going to happen now and in the future. The listing agent is going to work for the seller, and the seller is going to pay the listing agent. So the question is, who's going to pay the buyer agent? So there are 4 kind of scenarios in which the buyer agent gets paid. Scenario 1 is the seller will pay the listing agent $6,000, and the seller will also pay the buyer agent directly $4,000. The second scenario, the seller continues to pay the listing agent their $6,000, and then the buyer will pay their buyer agent directly $4,000. A third scenario could be a combination where the seller pays the listing agent, and then the seller and the buyer, during the process of negotiating the terms of the offer, agree to share what they pay the buyer agent. And the last situation is where the seller still pays the listing agent the $6,000, and then the seller pays a concession of $4,000 to the buyer, which the buyer can then use to pay their buyer agent. So if you notice, there is no longer cooperation compensation. The 2 brokerages do not cooperate and they do not share commissions. So there are 2 main things that we need to know. So number 1, buyer's agents must enter into a written agreement that clearly discloses the details of the compensation that will be received prior to touring any homes. Number 2, compensation is paid directly by the seller or the buyer, so we call it seller-directed compensation or buyer-directed compensation. There's no more cooperation or sharing of commissions between the listing agent and the buyer agent. Now you may have some questions, so I've put together 5 of the questions that I actually hear the most. The first question is, are commissions fixed or set? And what I'll tell you is nothing is fixed or set, and nothing ever has been. The buyer and the seller need to agree upon certain terms, which include compensation, and none of it is set, and the terms of a house can differ in every transaction, which ensures the smoothest way for buyers and sellers to get the terms that they want. So number 2 is, I've heard that I don't have to pay commissions anymore. And this is actually true. You never had to pay commissions. The most important part of this is the commissions are consideration paid for representation. So if you would like professional representation, then there's a fee that comes with it. For example, there are situations where a home seller may choose to list their home on their own, for sale by owner, and not pay a listing side representation for that. And there are times when a buyer may choose not to be represented in this process, so they don't have to pay the buy side representation. Now, there are studies that have shown that utilizing and working with a licensed professional almost always provides you a better result. So it's up to you on whether you don't want to pay commissions or you do want representation, just like you would with a CPA or your attorney or any other professional service like a dentist. Third question I hear is, do I have to sign a buyer representation agreement? Yes, this is just like we sign a listing agreement to bring a home to market. As a potential home buyer, you will need to sign a buyer representation agreement to engage in the professional services of a buyer agent. And your agent can help you through that process and take you through all the terms of that representation agreement so that they can work in their full fiduciary capacity with you. Now, the fourth question I hear a lot is, does this only apply to certain markets or certain types of properties? This applies to all residential real estate properties, and it applies to the entire United States. And the last question I hear a lot is, can I just work with my agent that I already know and love? Absolutely. Of course you can. Nothing changes in who you work with. So contact your agent and they will tell you all about it.